And with that said, we are live. Hello, guys. This is Suris the Skeptic. You guys are here, so you probably know my channel. At least I would hope so. If not, you're stalking me, and this is strange. Otherwise, I have my co-host here, who is Jim Hall from Atheist Edge. And
hello.
He's going to be helping me handle this, the cacophony that is going to be tonight, which is going to be... we have RJ Downard, who I talked with on the Godless Islands channel, and I'm not going to try to introduce him right now because he will do a much better job of doing that himself. RJ, how are you doing?
Oh, well, muddling along here. I've eaten my dinner, so I'm digesting and I'm ready to go. I understand we're going to have lots and lots of neat little questions. I love to have my brain picked on the science and the relationships between evolution and creationism and sundry subjects, so we can go any which way. We got...
And suddenly we have the roboting already.
Oh boy.
Ooh, from me? From my end?
Yes.
I got everything shut down, so this is as best as I can do.
Well, fair enough. But with that said, I will go ahead and say that given the subject matter, I need to start off today with an atheist's worst nightmare.
Ray, comfort lives.
Oh boy. Yeah, nice.
There we are. All right, so we got a few people in the chat already. That's fine, though. We're going to have more people in from Non Sequitur Show as we go. But with that said, first, before we do anything else, RJ, would you like to say your credentials and what explain your TIP project real quick as well?
Oh, we have a BA in history, which I got from Eastern Washington University way long ago in the 1970s. I spent all of my time doing stuff other than that, from tarping tarps and making sheds to doing computer programming and all sorts of things and inventory stuff. But along the way, I always was interested in the sciences, and I began to become intrigued with the creationism stuff that was percolating up in the 1980s when they were trying to get into the schools, and then the intelligent design movement that came along in the 1990s. And by that time, I'd started the germ of working out an analysis, the Troubles in Paradise, TIP project, that would work out the methodology, not just what creationists talked about, but how did they build their arguments, and what did this reveal about how they put their arguments together, and what's going on. And bit by bit, gradually, stage where I'm at now, where I can distill it down to 4 super goals. The people who believe things that aren't true have an ability to read secondary sources and confuse them for primary sources, and they don't check them. So they're addicted to secondary sources. 95% of anti-evolutionists fall into that category. I'm not guessing, I'm measuring. And then the 5% who do, a big chunk of those are just copying it from somebody else. There's literally only a tiny core of about 50 fact claimants in the entire anti-evolution movement, and everybody else copies off of them. They bump into total about 4,000 sources, which turns out to be only about 10% of the working data field. Again, I'm not guessing these numbers. I'm measuring them source by source by source, because I've got tens of thousands of sources in my bibliography. So we can see then that they're missing, and then they have an ability to get into a next box, which is they don't really think through what they think happened with that data field. Even their little itty bitty 10%, they don't really figure it out. They don't really work out what kinds are, what speciation means, what natural mutation involves. This is across the spectrum from intelligent design all the way to young Earth creationism. And then beneath that is the killer 4th problem. What would change their mind? And Ken Ham was being really honest when he said nothing, because that's functionally it. They literally cannot conceptualize information that they would accept to change their mind. And this is painfully obvious when you look at transitional forms, which I do in shameless plug department, Evolution Slam Dunk, my book on the reptile-mammal transition and how anti-evolution is misrepresented. So, and I got a website. Doesn't everybody have a website?
Your website is actually linked. Your website is actually linked in the description.
And everybody can find all the links. There's tons of stuff to share on there. People can put in questions if they want to pick my brain. They can do it on Twitter and all the rest. So that in a nutshell is the world of TIP, where I'm trying to document things in a way that nobody else had ever done before. And hopefully better arm people, because source methods is a game that anti-evolutionists can't play.
Fair enough. Awesome. And for anybody who is wondering, yes, the links to RJ's channel and his Twitter are both in the description, as well as, and this is the other thing that I would like to mention to anybody, if you can support RJ's project, I actually have his Patreon linked there as well for anybody who would like to go ahead and do that.
Put the GoFundMe up instead, because Patreon's slow as molasses on getting funds.
Yes,
the GoFundMe is way quicker. There's some people who have actually abandoned that because they sit on a lot of low-income folk like me and basically don't disperse. So you're donating to me, but I'm not getting the donating to me. And so I still list all the Patreons no matter what, including you. You've been added to the list because you've put up thing no matter whether or not I get it or not. But the GoFundMe, that I get literally in just a couple days.
Fair enough.
Hey, Suris, could I just jump in just real quick?
Sure.
Just lead off. Okay. RJ, you mentioned right off the top that when you're dealing with these anti-evolutionists, that you asked them what would change your mind, and you get some pretty honest answers. That not the answers we would like, but you know they're closed off. But to flip the script, if someone that denied evolution were to ask you the same thing, what would change your mind? What would you have to say about that?
Oh, well, first they'd have to get rid of all the evidence that suggested evolution were true. So they'd have to flush the reptile-mammal transition down the drain. They'd have to get rid of the ALUs in our genome and all of that stuff. And so it's the same way if you ask somebody, a flat earther asks you what would persuade you that the Earth isn't a globe.
Instead of getting rid of evidence that already exists, what type of new evidence would have to come out for you to scratch your head and go, oh, this might all be wrong?
Oh, well, yipes. I mean, it's really difficult. Any blips on the scope now that there's just no space for that to get in for the last couple billion years of life. That we've got too many transitions, we've got too much of a track record of success from the scientific community, and too bad of a track record. I'll put it this way, in terms of what would have persuaded me that the flood happened, was I would have expected a flood layer to be everywhere. I would have expected it to be easily identifiable. I could go outside. Everybody could go outside and see the geology and make sure, oh gosh, yes, this stuff is sorting in exactly the way we would expect by a gigantic sloshy wave. And we'd be able to explain the biogeography of animals radiating out from Ararat. We'd see why the fossils are deposited the way they are. Everything would make sense, but that's not what we get. So any of these views that are so far removed from things like the anti-relativity people or anybody else, the short answer is that you'd have to get rid of all the evidence that already shows that's true. And I can't forget it's there.
The only reason I ask is my common response to that type of question is, well, maybe how about, let's say, a fully formed Homo sapien, modern Homo sapien skeleton under the KT layer. That's something that might make me scratch my head.
Yeah, a Precambrian Homo sapien.
A lot of those.
Yeah, a Precambrian Homo sapien, right? Exactly.
Yeah, that would immediately make me start
supposedly there have
scratching
been
my head.
cases of creationists that insist that. There was the wonderful, I think it's called the Moab track, where there's supposedly some sandaled person that was apparently squashing a trilobite. And it's just a geological feature. It's nothing particularly unusual. But the notion that there was somebody wandering around on the bottom of the seafloor during the Cambrian 6,000 years ago and squashing trilobites. What, did he have a little snorkel set on? You know, I mean, it's just a weird piece of misplaced concreteness. But yeah, any of these things, if we, to be fair on the origins question and the intelligent design irreducible complexity question, theoretically, if it could be shown in the same way that we can show thermodynamically that perpetual motion is impossible, that living systems can never develop prebiotically, at least puts a nudge at the beginning. It doesn't make the reptile-mammal transition go away, but at least it would get the origins or bust thing off of just a philosophical position. Similarly, if you could really establish, as Behe wants to, that an irreducibly complex system really can't ever develop by natural means, and it doesn't look that that's the case based on the kinds of examples that he brings forward. Typically could be a significant issue in the idea of a meddler god that comes in and says, hey, gee, I want to make flagella, and does it one or more or how many times. But that still puts the onus on the believer in intelligent design to explain how many design events were there, when, how many designers, and to really work through their model, and they don't do that.
Okay.
Does that answer that a little clearer?
Yes, yes, very much so. Thank you.
Very clear and concise answers.
Mm-hmm.
Well, clear.
Well, you mentioned Behe and
concise ain't my game.
Yeah, I was about to say I had to redact the concise.
Behe is still just widely touted from the other side, even though he seems he lost all credibility after the Dover trial, but it didn't seem to faze them a bit.
Only among scientists, but amongst the intelligent design crowd, all of them are considered just heavy gun people. It's not just Behe. If you look at Douglas Axe, if you look at Ann Gager, if you look at any of the gang in there, Cornelius Hunter and all the rest, they just are certain that their side is the vanguard of a tremendous scientific revolution. And those poor benighted evolutionists out there that are all the people actually doing the work just can't quite see the implications of all of this. But they're all interlopers. None of them are heavy duty people. The science department in Lehigh University, where Behe is a professor, really kind of go, oh, Behe, yeah, we know about him. Yeah, he's Really? And I know Steve Meyer. I used to run into him when he was here at Whitworth, which was a Presbyterian university up in just north of me. And he was in the philosophy department. And I can tell you that there were people in the science department who were most happy when he left, because they didn't have to worry about him being attached to Whitworth University anymore.
See, Suris, that's the stuff we don't hear about. That's behind the scenes stuff right there.
Oh yeah, I've been collecting a lot. I bumped into Meyer a lot here because I first bumped into him in '98 when they had he arranged for a basically a sandbag thing. They had a bunch of anti-evolutionists gathering together under the hegemony of Philip Johnson, and then they brought in Ken Miller as the one and only evolutionist, and didn't really give him a heads up that this was going to be like a gang up. And he was a little bit pissed off about it. But anyway, I had to take some time off of work and was able only to attend a few of the meetings. And that's the first time I ever saw Steve Meyer. I didn't even know who he was. And he was starting to put in claptrap and that maybe it was a fake. And I raised my hand in the back and says, no, that was debunked. That was completely erratic. And he immediately backed off of it. So I had a visceral interconnection with how evasive and fiddly bit Steve Meyer could be. I mean, Behe, and some of the other heavy guns. I did have a chance to quiz Jonathan Wells over in Seattle last year, where I was able to confirm that he contributed absolutely nothing to his book with Dembski that retread a pen. And that really quite surprised me. Anyway, I digress on these things. But yeah, I being an old fart, as you can see from the picture, I'm the poster child for old fart. I've got enough of a track record into this. In fact, I'm going to have a guy on my Evolution Hour in a couple of weeks who actually listened to a lecture and debate that Dwayne Gish was involved in, and that's going way back. And I'm really anxious to pick his brain on that.
I got it's kind of a question from the audience. Regarding the a common retrovirus present in all mammals, pointing at a common ancestor. Do you think that's a good argument for evolution?
Oh, it's frosting on the cake. My favorite retrotransposon is ALU, if you're familiar with that. I can't remember what it's an acronym for. It's one of these really long sciencey terms that I can't usually rattle off right from memory, but so everyone just calls it ALU in the literature. And there are 1.5 million plus copies of ALUs in the human genome. 10% of us is ALU. And the reason why it's there is because somewhere back in the primate lineage, a version of it got attached, and it's got a copy me signal to where it says copy me, copy me, copy me, copy me, but it has no read me code. And so it just copies and copies and copies and copies and copies periodically and latches on. But all it takes is one little mutation, and it turns the leading edge of it into a read me code. That is not usually a good idea. And so there are a lot of diseases that have cropped up because suddenly a transposon is buried inside of a protein and it causes the folding to misfold and therefore causes it to foul up. But once in a while, it turns out to be beneficial. And it turns out that some of our brain systems make use of ALUs.
And that's common in all mammals?
It's a primate lineage. There is a cousin of it, which I think is called B something or other. I alluded to it in Slam Dunk because Jonathan Wells riffed past it in his book on junk DNA, and that one is actually in mice. And so the exact roots of where this pops up in the primate or in the vertebrate lineage is kind of hard to tell, because all you can have a little thing that's popping along. It's a relatively small string. I can't remember what it's like. It's 3,000 nucleotides long or something like that. It's not very big. But if it mutates in just the right way, then it can become one of these little hitchhikers that floats around in the genome and doesn't do anything until it accidentally turns on. And so there's a whole slew of these things. The other thing that's a tracker are typos and introns. When you've got a particular mutation in a particular spot, and a suite of mutations can occur and gradually get cemented in. But introns are the parts of the DNA that are ignored when they make proteins. And there's a whole bunch of mechanisms that do that. And that's a whole big other fascinating issue of why that mechanism is done. Why is the genome as clunky as it is? When they first noticed, when they were first working out genetics, they were thinking if you were designing it like a normal person, you would have one gene per protein. That seems reasonable, doesn't it? You know, and that makes it neat and tidy. And so we got 100,000 proteins. There should be 100,000 genes, and there's only 20,000. And every single gene almost is multiply used. It can be read in the peeled off version that gets duplicated, that has the cognate codes. It can be read backwards. It can be, and pieces of it can be removed and a section of it put together. And it's this weird superstructure of regulator codes that go along, that the ones that work because they survive. But occasionally these things can screw up and diseases can occur from all these little kludgy systems gumming up the works. It's kind of like the Model T Ford of biology, where Wankel engines are way more efficient, but they have to be kept pristine and perfect, otherwise they screw up.
That's right.
Whereas the Model T is clunky. It can have malfunctions. You can be low on oil. There's a whole bunch of things about an internal combustion engine that make it kludgy enough that it'll function even if it's kind of clunky. Well, that's how the DNA system functions. And so it has its downsides. Leukemia, for example, when the view is an enemy. But more often than not, it works pretty damn well. And so all of those little bits and pieces that show the clunkiness that eventually turn into where you can see that we primates make use of a particular suite of things, whereas if you look in mice, or if you look in whales, or if you look in echinoderms or anything else, they have their own lineages. And there's a monstrous, vast amount of technical literature that tracks all of these little fiddly bits in there. And I can tell you by directly measuring it, anti-evolutionists are oblivious to 90% of this stuff. So they literally don't know the data field. And when they do trickle in once in a while, like Jeffrey Tompkins, the young Earth creationist, does on the human chromosome 2 fusion, they're very picky choosy about how they fiddle with the data field. They can't account for all of it. See, my digression goes on again.
It goes on as far as it needs to, but that's fine, because I'm actually going to use this as the most half-assed, butchered segue into the first major question. With that said, one of the first questions that was submitted, and the person who is submitting the questions is going to be anonymous, but I know him personally, and he's a person who I respect a lot. However, there are some things that do need, not necessarily need to be addressed, but there are some questions that he does have, and we are presenting them to RJ because he is the human Google here. Jim had a cringy face there.
I don't know if did you tell the audience this individual, although he's remaining anonymous, we can divulge that he is an atheist, correct? And he does not accept evolution through natural selection in the way that everyone else does, correct?
Okay.
Is that right?
And that is about as far as we as far as we can divulge.
Okay.
However, that's not necessarily a bad thing, because it does lead to some interesting questions. So the first question that is here that was relayed to me to relay back is one of his first big issues with evolution would be, what is the supposition that would lead to Homo sapiens sapiens to be ill-suited to the environment in which they are stated to have evolved in? And why do we have so many genetic disorders in comparison to other organisms on Earth?
Oh, well, I question that second assumption, that we have more genetic things. First of all, we haven't done full genomes for every bloody organism. We've got lots, but not everyone. And usually they're one example of an organism, and so you don't necessarily have a range of the entire population. And in some cases, they're immensely difficult to do. Do we really know the genetic load and variation in ant species? There are 20,000 of them. So how exactly would you determine that? So it's questionable. We do know that we have a somewhat different mutation rate in some ways than chimpanzees and others that have relatively few species, and we can look at a little bit more things, and they're more accessible. Marine species are a pain in the ass to try to go after. You ever try to track down a sperm whale to get its DNA? You know, it's not so easy. So so there's a bit of data selection on that front. The other aspect is, I don't think typically species are ill-suited to their environment with this proviso. Environment changes. And so it fluctuates up and down and in and out. I suppose he may be riffing off of the notion that if humans evolved initially in a kind of a savanna environment with a particular temperature range and a particular things down in Africa, and then we spread around across the world, that makes us ill-adapted. But the problem is, by the time even Homo erectus, before we get to Homo sapiens, by the time Homo erectus is on the scene, they spread all over the place. They leave Africa. There are Homo erectuses in Asia. An offshoot of them become the Neanderthals. They're wearing clothing. They're making tools. They're figuring out how to do fire. But before you get to our species, we're already changing the game. That, okay, we have an unusual environment we want to live in. We change the conditions to suit us rather than the other way around. It gets cold at night, we make fire. It gets cold at night, we put on clothes. We skin animals and make stuff. And so we're no longer affecting. Anybody that can see people like me with glasses, it doesn't matter what my eyeballs are doing. We create a technology to compensate for it. So that's probably been going on way back. The whole point of a tool is that you're taking a piece of rock, flaking it, turning into something to butcher an animal to get more food out of it. So now you are making the environment more suitable to your needs rather than the other way around. So
rather than adapting to you're adapting to the environment rather than the environment adapting around you.
And the other problem is that, what does it mean? In genetics, they get into this all the time. Is there such a thing as a positive or a negative variation? Well, it depends. A particular point mutation could be really benign in most circumstances. That thing happens, it won't do a damn thing. They see this a lot in relation to bacterial infections and bacterial resistance to infections, how they can respond to our medicine that we're putting against them. A particular mutation, I went into this with a chloroquine case regarding Michael Behe, who we discussed earlier, and his claims that he had made in his more recent books on the subject, where he was trying to use chloroquine resistance as a disproof for macroevolution, including, of all things, the reptile-mammal transition, which he never discussed. But when I looked into the actual fiddly-bit details, which he didn't, it turns out a whole suite of mutations alter the dynamic of the organism as it's relating to that medicine. And one particular mutation on one side of a pore needed another mutation to kick in order to alter the effect. And it became a trade-off for that organism, that it meant that the medicine couldn't quite get through to be able to cause the degrading of this stuff that the organism needed to be able to survive. But it also meant that it's not effectively interacting with its environment in that way. But it turns out there's other parts of the organism that can mutate to compensate for that. So when you looked at the whole package, what was a positive mutation depends on the context. In our own human context, there's a spectacular one, which is the yipes, brain fart, sickle cell anemia. Because there, it's an example of a single point mutation that renders our blood cells prone to leaking a certain amount of calcium.
But it also helps against malaria, doesn't it?
Exactly. That this has arisen 3 times independently in the human populations. The most prominent one in Africa, but in various other contexts where malaria has popped up, the same mutation pops up. Because although if both of your parents give it to you, you run the risk of that malaria or the sickle cell anemia. If only one parent does and you have a marginal system where you got a bit of it, that makes you much more resistant to malaria. And because malaria kills more people than the sickle cell does, there is a selection pressure to sustain it in the population. Now, so you had a whole bunch of Africans in Africa that had a very good reason for that. Well, they were forcibly removed from Africa and taken in the slave trade into an environment where malaria was no longer as prominent. Now that positive negative mutation now becomes a purely negative one because there's now no malaria to protect against it. And all you're spotting is the sickle cell aspect. So that's an example of a directly negative thing that can be sustained in the population. There's probably a lot more of those cases. I think there's some circumstantial evidence that the mutations leading to cystic fibrosis and I think a few other illnesses have ones that have a scorched earth things, that they were positively defending against something else. And then we change the environment, and now all you get is the downside part. So
was that a happy coincidence, or did the cells in malaria-prone areas become evolved to be sickle-shaped specifically to battle against?
Oh no, it's never that latter. It's always just accident. In other words, that will have occurred everywhere in all populations at about the same incidence. But in a population where there's no malaria, it doesn't take many generations before Uncle Harold has died away because of the damn sickle cell mutation. And it never gets into the mix. So we don't have any of their descendants to look at to say, oh dear, this one popped up in Thor Halkerson in 1232. We don't have any way to determine that. All we can do is look at the existing populations. And that.
Suris, I don't want
everything that we can see. Jump in.
Oh, sure. This is from the chat, and it's kind of a beautiful segue, and I won't step on you again. Okay. It's not quite a question, but they were bringing up vestigial DNA strings, and are they all vestigial, or are some of them purposely redundant?
Not sure that vestigial is quite the right word. We do have an awful lot of non-coding DNA. In fact, most of the genome is non-coding. And for a long time, it was labeled just temporarily junk. And then they found out that big chunks of it were actually doing regulatory things. We have to remember, always keep in mind that there's multiple layers of DNA. DNA that makes the proteins that are you, that make up the stuff that makes up skin, and keratin and all, that's a big chunk, but that's a minority. Above that are the regulatory, cis-regulatory DNA. These are the things that turn the genes that make that stuff on and off. And then higher up on that are the larger homeobox genes and all of those that are the ones that deploy the systems that deploy those. And then on top of that, you have those damn epigenetic markers, those little methylation cues that wind or unwind things and regulate the regulation of a thing. So you can have changes in an organism just because the same gene, unchanged, gets regulated and activated a little bit more or a little bit less, or turned on or turned off at particular times and places. And those things are like Sonic Hedgehog. My favorite is named for Sonic Hedgehog, the video game character. And I think
you can't forget Robotnikin.
Yeah, you have a lot of that stuff that where they got a sense of humor and it shows. But vestigial DNA it may refer to those elements. What I would refer, if I'm going to use that term at all, would be to a non-coding DNA that literally doesn't do anything, that these are pseudogenes. These are things that have been cut off. They're stuck on the edge of things. Trying to figure out what exactly is going on, though, is immensely complicated. Normally, most genetic systems involve stuff that's relatively adjacent. When the DNA gets kind of coiled up into a big soup, like a spaghetti pile, the kinds of things that are nearby are being recruited by these regulatory systems and trigger off stuff. But it turns out that there can be stuff that can be rather far downstream, thousands of nucleotides or more down, that are actually linking up to that, and they're still trying to figure out how the hell that happens.
Wow.
I think part of the reason why it's confusing at the moment is because people tend to forget what goes on in the cell. If you think of it as like a nice long string of DNA, and there comes along a little thing that latches onto it and splits the gene apart, and it makes a little copy of it in RNA, and the RNA is then taken off to a ribosome where it gets plugged in and it starts making a protein by pulling in amino acids, and after it's all done, it snips away, and then it goes carried off by something to become a nice functional little protein, and everything is nice and neat like a nice machinery floor, like you were looking at a Honda.
That's not how it goes.
No, it's amino acid, amino acid, amino acid, amino acid. Oh, a regulator, 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 molecule, 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 molecule. It's happening at such blinding, blurring speed in this vast
I need to get a soundbite of that now. That needs to be the thing when somebody tries to tell me. Hey, somebody's like, "Oh yeah, well, how does DNA replicate?" Huh?
You read my mind, Suris.
I just have that soundbite right there. Like, this is how. Any questions?
It's just that fast. I think it's something like hundreds and more of amino acids per second that are being plugged together. It's just this crazy dance that's going on inside, and basically it doesn't know what to make. It's not an intelligent machine. It just replicate, spew, spew, spew. And we now know from the God, I can't remember the damn name of the stupid thing, that the ENCODE project, that most of what is in a particular stretch of DNA is manufactured anyway, and then whatever isn't used very quickly, the cleanup crew comes in and breaks it down. So that's the kind of the system that you have. And this is actually probably giving us clues to what was going on pre-last universal common ancestor, to all the weird little subsystems that are murking around that eventually ended up as the somewhat tidy amino acid, amino acid, amino acid system that we're used to already.
We do have another question in the chat. When the environment is mentioned in its role for altering the genome, it always seems that the environmental factors are filtered by the scientist. How do they know what the environment does?
Oh, okay. Well, that's a fun question. Nobody thinks in the kind of Lamarckian way that the environment causes mutations unless you got like radiation or chemical things. Those can cause mutations. Don't live next door to a nuclear reactor too long, things like that. Or fly too high because you get cosmic rays.
Or jump in a tanning bed naked, right?
Exactly. And so you can get mutations that way. But when they're talking about the environment, they're talking about all of the various aspects of it. That an organism, it doesn't exist in a vacuum. First of all, you are a habitat. Let's take our host here and dissect his environment. Inside of him are more non-him cells, Suris cells, than there are Suris cells. He's a habitat. He's got his gut microbiome doing its little thing. A lot of the digestion that Suris thinks he's doing, yes, exactly, are actually the bacteria doing all of that. And then, of course, there may be little critters living up in the eyelashes, and there's a whole bunch of other stuff going on. But more importantly, if he were living, say, in the Pleistocene, where he had to go out and hunt for the food directly, now you're interacting with the environment of how do you get your food and how do you avoid being eaten by the leopard next door. And so all of those things come into it. Then you have the parasites that can come along. Is there some little critter that lives inside of the food you just ate that now gets attached to your body that you have to then deal with as all part of your environment? So needless to say, working out the environment's effect upon an individual organism is already complicated. Working out the impact it's going to have on a population of organisms spread over hell's half acre becomes ever more complicated. And these are the areas that put you into the upper level of dynamic modeling in current evolutionary theory to try to figure out how can you account for a lot of these things. There was just a paper by weird coincidence that Jackson Wheat alluded to me just a bit before, just a couple days ago, about is there a coupling between natural selection and mutation selection and the environment? Ta-da! And it turns out no. In other words, the idea that a given mutation is going to be selected for in a predictable way, environmental natural selection stimulus, doesn't turn out to be true, because the dynamic range within a particular species or different organisms is varied so much that it's functionally case specific. So in some cases, high temperature environment will select against that mutation. And in other environments, that same environment will select in favor of it in different organisms because of how it connects up with all the other stuff. So what needless to say, it's an immensely complex thing. The only way you can test it out is what you have to test out are the individual components. There you can try to put in the laboratory, or there you can try to do small field tests with individual representatives of things to try to do selections, or take samplings to let natural selection operate in the wild, and you measure the data blips that you can find off of it. And that requires damned hard work, because you've got to measure things often over years. You have to measure samples over a long period of time. And it's all in the ecology and evolution literature. Some of it will pop up in the regular science, the PNAS Science and Nature journals, but a lot of them will be in very specialized journals. And I know by personal experience, I've got over 1,800 journals in my tip bibliography. It's impossible to keep track of all of that. So what it would be involved with is that you would be talking about a specific case of environmental relationship to selection, and then you'd have to dive in and look at that work specifically. But I'll guarantee you that the vast majority of it will be available online, and you can look at it, and you'll see that they're very meticulous and careful about working out what they can conclude based on the available information. How much that can then translates, if you just look at it as a thought picture. In principle, just imagine you've got 7 billion human beings on the planet, each with billions, trillions of microbes inside of each one. You've got billions of organisms. You have a comparable mass of ants as there are people. You've got birds, you've got nematodes, you've got microbes, you've got plants, you've got predators, prey, all of these things doing their thing. Everything is doing everything naturally.
Not unlike how your brain works.
Yeah, and that too.
Everywhere.
And all modeling anticipate what that whole ecosystem is going to do 5, 10, 100, 1,000 years, assuming there's only gradual environmental change or continent shifting or whatever. But then the asteroid comes along, or the volcanic plume decides to breach, and it throws more carbon dioxide into the air and sulfur dioxide and starts altering those dynamic relationships. Bingo. And so even on climatology, how difficult it is, although they're doing it, paleoclimate is a real fascinating issue. I just love that because it bumps straight into young Earth creationism, among other things. But the idea that how, example, does carbon dioxide affect the atmosphere, and how does it affect the oceans? Well, part of the things affecting the oceans involves which way you got the oceans arranged. Do you have them separated out like we do now, where there's an Atlantic, and then there's a bigger Pacific, and then there's an Arctic Ocean that freezes over, and then there's stuff circumpolar around a big landmass down on the bottom? That's very different from Pangea, where you had a pole-to-pole supercontinent and one monstrous ocean everywhere else that stretched pole to pole.
It's a very different
the
environment.
dynamics of currents, they're all very, very different. And all of that stuff, it makes the science fabulously interesting, because it's like an immense 3-4 dimensional time puzzle where you have very few pieces available, and yet every piece does in fact connect together, and it forms larger patterns over time that you can test out. And I think it's absolutely fascinating.
And I do believe that Jim had a question from the chat that he was very, very antsy to ask.
Jump in, man! Jump in!
Jump in!
I will jump. I will do better at trying to jump in. This is just so damn fascinating, though. I've got two from the chat. Here's the first one from. It's kind of early on, if Bud Askins is even watching still, but
he's still watching.
Okay, he said, "We have all heard the observation that all religions cannot be right, but they all can be wrong. Could the same be said about creationism and evolution?" I don't know exactly where he's going with that.
Well, the point is, in the beginning is the data, and the data is sacrosanct, and all viable hypotheses must account for the data. Amen. That's the thing that we have to deal with. And I don't have to guess that if somebody presents a not really worked out hypothesis that ignores most of the data field, that they're not on the playing field at all. They don't realize they forgot the ball. And so at the moment, the reason why evolution is the game in town is because it's worked, and it not only accounts for the data, but predicts new data on a just spectacular level. So the general principle, natural branching, descent, is how I like to say it. I know the textbook one is allele vary in a population of organisms, can believe that too. So it's not that useful in terms of delineating. But natural branching common descent is my working definition. That stuff fits the data. It explains it. It's the unique explanation for it. And the reptile mammal transition was the kick butt example of it, that you even had predicted fossils. And so the creation model, if they want to come up with one, fine and dandy, by all means. If you're a young Earth creationist, if you're an intelligent designer, come in and explain the data. Explain why there were probanic transitional mammals back in the Mesozoic. Explain why we got the ALUs. I'll often ask a creationist on there that talks about information in genetics. I'll say, do all the ALUs in our gene information, and were any of them deliberately designed to be there? Okay. If you can't answer that, you don't have a model.
And I do have, I do desperately want to get into more questions that are from the chat as well, but I'm going to go ahead and segue into one more question from one of the ones that was from before the stream that needed to be answered in here. I'm almost 100% certain with the amount of time we have, we will not be able to answer all the questions here, nor all the ones in the stream. However, I would like to say, just in case that is the case, and I'm almost 100% certain it will be, RJ does actually have a show he does on Wednesdays for this as well. I believe it's called Evolution Hour. Am I right?
Tomorrow, even. Yes. So
I
will be doing it tomorrow at 5 o'clock.
Any questions that we are not able to get to here today for whatever reason, RJ, links to RJ's Twitter and everything else are in the description below. You can follow him, and he will announce when he is doing those things, and you can ask those questions there as well. And eventually, you will be able to have that answered if we cannot get to it here. So apologies if we can't do it here. But with that said, the next question would be, or I think it's a statement. The Pyracus, I believe, the Pyracus elongated skull is a very recent topic getting some press and buzz. What do you have to say on it, or do you know much about the issues?
Yeah, I haven't heard of that one. Does he know what thing it's of? Pyracus, elongated skull. Wow. Yeah, unless not Pyracosaurus or anything like that.
Well, he might end up clarifying. If so, then go ahead and send me a message. Because obviously, if he is watching, so he will be able to send me a message about this.
They stumped the RJ.
With that said, the next question that he had, since we are going to have to wait for some clarification on that, humanity, one race. I mean, in terms of biology, humanity is more of a species with divergent breeds, similar to horses. They are different breeds. If race is another name for species, then what is the term for various breeds?
Oh, well, no, race is not another name for species. It would be the race is what we would call subspecies today in the modern nomenclature. And so all human beings are Homo sapiens, independent of what air quotes race they are. And although blobs of populations can have very distinctive characteristics looked at as a blob, when you try to break it down to figure out, are these permanent in any way? No. Are they necessarily terribly meaningful? In often cases, no. Probably the least interesting feature on human beings is the trivial skin pigmentation. And yet, boy, have people made a big deal out of that one over the years. Also, we do have it's really weird.
We do have a bit of clarification. Apparently, the Peru civilization of elongated skulls, I believe.
Oh, those. That I do actually know about, yeah.
Of course you do.
Yeah, Peru and the
Lord.
Mayans.
Where did you find this guy, sir?
Various... I just didn't recognize the name. Yeah, that the skull elongation. They put stuff on, or they'll in the early years as the skull is beginning to form, they'll do skull deformations. And the Maya were also very fond of this. It was a sign of elitism that you physically bend yourself around. You find in other ways in the Chinese culture where they would foot bind women, and so they would have these little tiny stumplets, and they were thought tremendously erotic to have these little teeny feet and little teeny shoes on them. And so different cultures, the various lip elongations that African cultures have often done, the earlobe maneuverings, and look at the Maoris with their tattoos. There's all sorts of modifications, and skull modification pops up. It's not genetic, it's environmental, in the fact that if you press down and put boards and do things to bend the skull around, you can make the thing deformed out of shape that way. There are some biological things that can produce some kinds of skull elongations naturally anyway, but this doesn't seem to be related to what was going on with either the Peruvian or the Mayan case or the other cultures that make use of that. So sorry to not pop the champagne cork on that one. It's just kind of like a minor foible of, they thought this shit was pretty.
Fair enough. Then we've got one more. Now that we've got two questions that were previously ready, I will go ahead and do one from the chat. It's from a bit further up, but that seems to be what's going to be the trend here. Jonathan Edward had a question. He said to please tell him about telomeres in the chromosome that shows or implies that 24 chromosomes went to 23. He also said, P.S. He's drunk, atheist, rule and beer is good.
Oh, referring to earlier with Jeffrey Tompkins. And there's some intelligent designers that quibble over it too. Basically, we have one less chromosome pair than our primate cousins. And somewhere along the path in the origination of human beings, and exactly when we can't tell because we don't have the DNA of Australopithecines to look at or Homo erectus to look at. We don't get that until we go way down the road to Neanderthal and the Denisovans. Much more recently, it's only 100,000 years ago or less. But of that, the primate genes got fused together. Chromosome fusion occurs occasionally all across animal life. It's not unique to this. It pops up in a variety of contexts, and you can have chromosome fusions and a whole bunch of other things in a lot of contexts. But there's a dead giveaway to it because each gene normally has a centromere. Duh, it's in the center. And then the telomeres on the end that are like the shoelace clips on the end of a shoelace, and there's a whole string of them. And they gradually worn off over time, which is why aging processes, eventually the gene becomes degraded because its little protective telomeres get worn away. So that's some of the bit. Well, if you take two genes and fuse them together, what you end up with is a thing where there's two sets of centromeres, and then there's a connection zone that's actually formed of old telomeres. And you can gradually modify all of that. But that's basically what we got in this fused gene that used to be the old primate one. And you can still see the cross connections on there. This, of course, screams natural branching variation and natural evolution. Because why would the designer, the nice creationist designer making human beings from scratch, want to put in centromeres buried inside of a gene that way and have it be so weirdly similar to the genes of the primates? You get an awful lot of headstands on that. Jeffrey Tompkins was a young earth creationist who has a genetics degree. He's down in the University of Georgia, so he's got creds in that respect. But at the same time, he's a minor player on the scene. He only pops up as a peripheral author on some technical papers, and then he does stuff at Answers in Genesis a lot.
That sounds a whole lot like John S.H. Tay, who has one book. He's a double PhD, one of them in genetics. But if you look at all the literature that he's done, it's all apologetics. Like, it is all apologetics. Yeah. But he has one book that is about genetics, but that one, it's basically him trying to say that homosexuals are not born gay, and it is definitely a choice. And again, it's just more apologetics. I think we find that with a lot of
as an old gay people. Fart here, I will say bullpucky on that one.
Yes, he was the subject. He was part of my he was the hardest part of my last video because it was an offhand thing that was said in the video I was responding to. But because it was an offhand thing said about somebody who was a double PhD, it led to 5 hours of research that I did not want to do on a 5-minute video.
What you'll often find, of course, if you're familiar with Arthur C. Clarke, he would be talking about if a distinguished but elderly scientist says that something is impossible, he's very probably wrong. And if a distinguished and elderly scientist insists that something is possible, he's very possibly right. But the thing is, older scientists can get stuck in ruts, and you can have a thing where they're often kind of riffing off of the material they learned when they were young, and their brains haven't really expanded much since then. So you get that a lot. You got Fred Hoyle, and is digging his heels on the Big Bang, even though he was initially a brilliant physicist, but he just gets that burr in his bonnet, and he just can't let go of it. what's his name? The guy that did vitamin C. Linus Pauling. He had various hobby horses that he would go on in that as well. And so often you have to be very careful to check to find out if they're like a professor emeritus. If they're my age or older, fact check them. I don't expect anyone to take what I say as gospel. You should fact check me too. So that's what makes life exciting. Anyway, so hopefully that answered a little bit of that question on the telomere issue and the genetic issue. That there's other examples. I'll just add a final nick on it, is that some have argued, Casey Luskin at the Discovery Institute, for example, tried to argue that it would be physically impossible to have a chromosome fusion because it would occur in like one animal, one person, and then you'd have to find a mate that matched up with that before you could do anything. No, as it turns out, you can mate chromosome fusion ones and it can spread through the population, and eventually if it becomes dominant, then so it was just wrong.
RJ, I've got a question for you from myself, if that's okay.
Sure.
Lately, when I talk to someone who does not accept evolution, I hate saying creationists, especially evolutionists. I feel that when they call us evolutionists, in fact, sometimes they mispronounce it on purpose, like evolutionists. I think they do it on. Yeah, I think they do it on purpose. As
they're going Richard Dawkins on there, because that would be the English. Like
right. Okay, it might be. All right. So here's my two biggest comebacks that I get, regularly nowadays, is the soft tissue in the hadrosaur and the polystrate trees. The polystrate trees. Now, my resource that I go to find out things is talkorigins.org. And it's not even called polystrate trees in there. It's called upright fossils. Upright fossils. And I think another thing the creationists do is relabel things. Instead of calling it upright fossils, they call it polystrate trees. So then when their congregation goes and searches for it on Google,
they get their apologetics.
Exactly.
Yeah. The two are very different fields. The soft tissue material, and it's a small block. You've got Armitage on the young Earth creationist side that's found the stuff in the Triceratops. The hadrosaur case is kind of a minor detail one. But then, of course, there's Mary Schweitzer, who was an evolutionist who worked with Jack Horner on finding tissues and various stuff inside of dinosaur bones. And it's always, in fact, I'm going to be discussing this very thing in tomorrow's show. I've got the material on it because I was so intrigued by the Armitage case and that it's always incredibly small things. It's literally microscopic. That it's not, and yet the creationist seems to think there's like these bodies of tyrannosaurs that have been preserved with just masses of blood vessels intact, and the stuff is practically spurting blood. And the creationists never tell you, no. If you have a tiny amount of stuff, organic material that's trapped inside of a sealed container, nothing necessarily changes. And you know what proof we have of this? Bugs in amber.
Amber. I was about to say
once
the amber.
Sealed off, that thing stays like that forever. It never disintegrates. And if there's no bacteria to get at it, the most bacteria will just die off under circumstances if they're not aerobic, and that lack of preservation, if things are in oxygen-free environments, there's no food for the little critters to draw off of. And if you cut that corrosive damned oxygen, that oxygen has been a damn trouble in our planet. Once those damn cyanobacteria started farting the stuff, it's been downhill ever since.
Well, we have another question now. This one's not from the chat. This is one of the previous ones.
Just before you jump in there, let me super duper quickly say polystrate fossils, because that was the other aspect. The polystrates, that's an old creationist terminology. It still pops up in creationist literature, but it's basically dating them, because this is really a non-starter issue. The vast majority of polystrate things are caused by pyroclastic flows, your Yellowstone things that come in, and I live next to a pyroclastic flow in Mount St. Helens, so I know exactly what those things do. And then the other stuff are like tidal surges that can suddenly bring in a bunch of gunk and cover over a forest, and bingo, and those things can all be going the way. They're very detailed geological forensics that help you identify those, and invariably the creationists that trot those out never bothered to look at any of the forensics.
So their explanation for it is that these layers were laid down very quickly. Sometimes, you know, we have the fossilized trees where the leaves are still on the tree. So it had to have been laid down before the leaves had a chance to rot even. So when they say that these layers were laid down quickly, they're not, they're actually correct, but it just doesn't occur like that on a global scale.
They're rapid. So the argument they tried to use, and this is where it makes it dated, is that older arguments would be arguing that you've got a layer and layer and layer and layer and layer of the geologic column. But if you have a tree that sticks up through a bunch of layers, then therefore it must have formed quickly, and therefore the entire geological system that pays attention to layer on layer on layer on layer is completely refuted. The problem is when you look at the kind of layers that are formed in these pyroclastic flows and how quickly they can form, where you can have a pyroclastic flow that kills the forest off and there's still trees sticking up, and then another pyroclastic flow that comes in a few days later or a few years later and buries it a bit more and buries it a bit more and buries it a bit more. You can still differentiate time zone and elements in that. It doesn't mean that the Grand Canyon suddenly becomes a thing that can form instantaneously, because there are different elements in that. And Andrew Snelling and Steve Austin and John Woodmarapp and Ord, these are some of the big offenders in this area. It's hilarious to track down some of the stuff. Snelling literally would be drawing on stuff that was decades, in some cases a century old. Here is a geologist and he's not bothered to look at the recent literature? Yipes. So that's the end of the polystrates. Now we get Suris. You still have that question.
Okay. Well, it just got superseded by another one that came up in the chat. Back to the issue of the skulls from a few questions back. An important question is, why do you accept cradle boarding without explanation of the abnormalities found in the skull, and no explanation for the anomalies, including red hair and T2B haplogroup?
That's another bit about red hair, why it pops up at all. Is it physically impossible for it to pop up anywhere? And what kind of DNA studies? I've not seen detailed analysis of this. The stuff that I've seen on the apologetic side is all secondary accounts and general newspaper accounts and general website accounts. There's not a hell of a lot of technical literature that's printed on it. So I would say don't pop the champagne corks until you can get some technical literature that delves into this more seriously, more professionally. That if you're going to riff off of secondary website accounts on this, you can get murky.
And then on that, now I can actually go to his to the original question, because now this actually piggybacks off that nicely. He says one of his issues is with the standard process of academia and the peer review process, as it obviously contradicts current accepted history, and they refuse to acknowledge our exposure to the elements, sun, gravity, environment, climate, as well as childbirth, 4,000 plus genetic anomalies, the fused 2 CD chromosome, to start off with a few. I'm reading it as it was sent to me.
I'll quote Lord Crocosquirrel, slightly modified. Effing citation needed. If he wants to put in a technical citation on there, funnel it on to me and we'll look. If he's just relying on secondary accounts, he's awfully detailed. The question is any of that stuff true, and how did you fact check any of it? About the peer-reviewed thing, fortunately, the argument, well, you know, the creationists won't get their stuff published in Science magazine, and I'll say, bullpucky, sure. But fortunately, we don't need that. They self-publish. I can read their material directly. They have their own journals that they publish in. So we get to see what all of these creationists think qualifies as scientific analysis, and we can then look through them and do our own source vetting. And I know for a fact how manipulative, how evasive, how superficial that stuff gets when you start looking at the primary source level, and anybody can theoretically do it. So if the guy's got a primary source technical citation on it that's relevant, throw it at us. But if he's just relying off of a website analysis and assertions about them, I'm afraid you should sock on that one.
Okay, fair enough. And then Chrismer actually had a question about what your thoughts on CRISPR are.
Oh, that's a fun one. Yeah, it's got a double-edged sword, because it's a way of tinkering with the genome. And is that all that a good idea? That it's still in its infancy. Don't expect it not to have a few big speed bumps going on right and left about it. But it is an interesting new technique. We're in that brave new world when we have more and more direct tools that can go down nanobot-like and tinker with individual point mutations to do the things we want to do. And therefore, we need to ask, do we want to do the things that we want to do? The Gattaca syndrome concept that you would have like a breed, the super race, is facing exactly the same problem that eugenics did. Define super race. What is a good mutation? What is a bad mutation? What is a good trait? What is a bad trait? If you were looking at Beethoven, who had no genetic offspring, was a terrible foster parent, had terrible bathing skills, and produced brilliant music, how do you select for that? How do you get the good parts and not the bad parts? Can sometimes you need some of the bad parts to go along with the good parts? No. So CRISPR, to the extent that it's going to be used as analytical tools to see how things function, and to some extent in point example cases help correct genetic defects that can be really meaningful for people's lives, of where it's a difference between having a healthy child and a dead one. It'll be a thing that we'll be exploring bit by bit by bit.
And that's really all that evolution cares about, is whether or not the child lives enough to reproduce. It really only functions to get to that point.
Yeah, and that's where human culture changes. The moment we started having a cultural frame that we now take care of grandpa, we now don't care whether you have survived just to produce offspring or not, that you can have Uncle Who's-its and aunts that convey information as well. And so now you have a social network that's no longer, are you warding off demons there?
Let me unmute myself quick. Pan is attacking me viciously with the stick that we use to play with our cats. And
oh my!
Would you like to come towards the camera so people can see the person assaulting me?
Let's all see. The class wants to see.
She refuses to come in front of the camera, but she doesn't refuse. Okay, I will.
RJ. Oh, I think.
Getting...
Oh, I thought he just paused.
No,
I thought he just paused in mid-stroke. Did you see that?
No,
RJ, I'm going to use this.
That's actually where my tail is.
I'm going to use this opportunity.
Well, there was a comic relief moment. So, what was the next question on your list then?
Hold on.
I would like to maybe just jump in with my final one if I could.
Give 1 second. Do yours right after this.
Okay.
So the follow-up to what you said was, and this was to the elongated skulls thing again, because we're still moving down that train. Without access to citation, peer review, in quotation marks, then your assertion is invalid, not looked into unless you do. So getting peer review to explain in layman's terms,
I didn't say peer review.
Okay.
I didn't say peer review. And all I have seen so far on that, the assertion that there's something mysterious about him, are kind of secondary accountings that are kind of website based. But if they want to go into that, let the dust settle on it. You can ask the guy, is he so committed to this thing? Is it really going to upset his apple cart if it turns out that these aren't what? Are they errant space aliens that have come down? Are they wandering red-headed Scotsmen who aborted a spaceship and flew down to Peru?
But are they not true Scotsmen?
What is your explanation for what they are? What do you think they are? Human beings migrate all over the place. There's some indication of certain haplotypes that pop up with red-headed people in China and others, and some of these things involving the spread of coca. And tobacco and things around in cultures that suggest that there's been some interesting conversions and passages over time. And the planet's a long history, and our species has a long history. Amazing things can happen. But if you're just throwing this out, that mystery, there's a mystery there. Well, what does it mean? What do you think it means?
Lee's saying it's an example of a knowledge filter.
You always have a thing when you're coming up with new data, you need to make sense about what the data is first. And what you often find are people who have a bit of an axe to grind. They're pushing the data rather ahead of the data. And what the whole peer review process involves is the idea that you have to put this up and present it to other people in the field. It should be replicatable. It should be studyable by others other than just you. and let the dust settle a bit on that. Now, if they want to argue that somebody is putting up barriers to the study of these things and they are suppressing information actively, well, then I will join with you in complaining about that. But I don't see any indication of that yet. And we'll want to know what sources is this person relying on and how do you vet them for reliability generally.
Okay, and then on that, I can probably grab... I can ask them for that at some point later down the road, and I can actually forward all of those to you via email. That way we can hash that
when I check
out.
My email, which isn't always
which isn't always the case.
My apologies.
But that said, Jim, you had a question you wanted to ask.
Yes, my last one, and I will be a happy camper. I've always wanted to ask an expert this. There's a thing, I think it's called an impact rating. Okay, an expert in the field has to stay, in order to stay relevant, he has to stay active in that field. Through publishing, through research, whatever. The best way to do that, okay. Have you met a creationist that's kept his impact rating high enough to where he's respectable amongst his peers? Does it happen? Are there any?
Let me use a broader term than creationist. Let me say anti-evolutionist.
Okay.
And impact factor. In fact, I haven't focused on that, but I am familiar with some of the stuff that's popped along. That you're quite right that there's a tendency that you get cited by the people who cite you, and then you get cited by more people because you were cited by the other people. But there are seminal papers in the field. There's the one where everybody is going light bulb. Wow, that's neat. And an example might be Gould and Eldridge's punctuated equilibrium paper that jump-started people thinking about how allopatry is detected in the fossil record, and that is an important that will have influence all the way down the line. Look, I track, one of the things I've been tracking in the anti-evolution thing is how many of them have actually academic things within the field. How many of them have done work within the actual fields that they're bumping into, as opposed to interlopers like Steve Meyer, who comes in and does his stuff on the Cambrian explosion when he isn't a paleontologist. And the answer is not many. I've only found so far about 70 who are published in the technical literature. None of them can be thought of as heavy guns in the literature. There's John Sanford is a geneticist, but he's small potatoes compared to somebody like Eugene Koonin, who has just an enormous impact on things. And so you can look at it from that measure. I look at it from the other measure of how practical and clarification are they on what their own views are. And whereas you can figure out what a Eugene Koonin or a Niles thinks about stuff because they're very verbose and they write technical papers on it and they discuss the subject, and you know where they stand even if they aren't all in agreement on every little fiddly bit. Anti-evolutionists are fog bank, vague on fundamental assumptions and attitudes within their own frame. And some are just that way by nature because they're young earth creationists, and so they've got this catch-all flood that they don't really much detail on figuring out, like explaining why their front yard looks the way it does.
Which is why they do the whole, oh, if we had a global flood, then we would expect to see dead things all across the world, and we see dead things all across the world and rock layers. And like, yes, that's incredibly vague. Now, as soon as you narrow that down, it all falls apart.
Yeah. Intelligent design, however, falls into the same box. And I'll tell you that the core area that unites them all is they really can't get a grip on speciation. One of the next books down the road, if I say, is going to be on kinds, depending on the kindness of strangers or the strangeness of kinds. I'm not entirely sure how I want to title it yet. And it's about that and baraminology and speciation. And all anti-evolutionists, without exception, can't quite figure out what the hell they think is going on with speciation. That either they deny it or they selectively apply it in weird ways. Young earth creationists functionally have to have super fast speciation after the flood to get all the species that we have.
It's one thing to say, and I've noticed this, and I've had this debate with a few young earth creationists. So you don't agree with macroevolution? No. Okay, sure. We'll hold that as a shelved problem for now. Now, do you believe in the global flood? Yes. Okay, how many species are on Earth? Give me that number. They can Google it if they want. Okay, how many species does Noah have on the Ark? We'll guess this many. It's incredibly lower than the number of species
really
on
good
Earth.
point, Suris. You know,
like
I never really thought of it that way.
Yeah, you can hit them with that and go, you don't believe macroevolution is real.
It's
No,
even worse than that.
And then show them how they have to have it, and incredibly quickly, mind you, in order to even get to the species that we have today. And you can cause a little, like, you can actually cause the wheels to stop turning for a second.
It's even worse than that. You have not one but two bottlenecks in the young Earth creationist model, because every single fossil that was killed in the flood, in principle, has to have been part of the created kinds.
Which means we have 99% of all species as created kinds that God killed and didn't let live, apparently.
Yeah, and so they have to be really frisky as to try to figure out how many created kinds there were that could generate all of that diversity in just the time between 6,000 and 4,400 BC, when the flood, or 2350 BC, 4,000 BC and 2350, when the flood supposedly took place. That's bottleneck one. Bottleneck two is all the animals of kinds, that was the initial starting number, would have been the ones on board the Ark. You have to keep that down. The number that I think they use at Answers in Genesis, the Ark Park, is just under 1,500.
And I have something to say about them once we have a chance.
Yeah.
So there is this weekend, for those who are not aware, and I'm going to be doing a video on this, one because it was actually requested of me in order to do this. But there's going to be a protest at the Ark Park this weekend, for those who are not aware. And if you are aware, awesome, please be there, because Answers in Genesis has a whole series of issues with them. Actually, Cat Brony has a very good series on Answers in Genesis, and he has some personal issues with them that have come up, like actual mental issues that have come as a result of that. And then we all know that Apologia has also been boycotted thanks to them, even though they will not say it in name.
Oh, yeah.
From talking at homeschool conventions. So we know that there's a whole big issue with Ken Ham and Answers in Genesis. So this is why normally I wouldn't be protesting somebody's beliefs just because they're their beliefs, but when they are demonstrably harmful, as the ones at AIG are. There is a protest happening at the Ark Park this weekend. Look it up. If you can be there, awesome. If you can't, then please forward that out, because it is a very important thing for us to do, is to take Ken Ham's bad ideas and try to keep them under a boot as best we can. Otherwise, they will riff out everywhere. And it was requested of me to do something related to the event. I was originally going to try to be there, but I can't due to funding. So I cannot be there for the event, but it was requested that I do something to cover the event. So part of that is getting that out here, since we are thankfully within the last 10 minutes on that topic of all things. And two, there will be a video later on my channel before the end of the week about the protest. That way I can try to raise awareness for it a little bit as we can.
Shoot me that info after the show also, Chris, and I'll get it out too.
Yeah, maybe this will give you even more ammo, because when I ran the numbers on it, I couldn't, there was a picture of the list of the Ark kinds that's on their website at the Ark Encounter. It's too blurry for me to read the actual names of them, but I could count them. And so I manually created a spreadsheet where I put in the numbers, you know, Therapsid 1, Therapsid 2, Therapsid 3, even though I didn't have the technical names for them because I couldn't read it. And if anybody can get inside or harangue them for a high-resolution picture or list, they don't publish any of this stuff, just what's on that, I'd love to see it. But the total number is about 1,500, of which by their own chart, over half of them went extinct. Boy, what a helpful Ark. The whole point of the Ark was to preserve life on the planet. They had a really bad failure rate, over half, even by their own numbers. But then they still have to accommodate how you get from that second bottleneck, that 1,500, all of the present diversity. And so just even in the case of the finch kind, which according to Susan Leitner is one of a created kind of the 100 and some odd, 180 odd bird kinds, and it looks like the Ark Encounter makes use of her number, that all species of finch had to have originated since Ararat before they were now seen in the wild. So that's 2,000 years or so. That involves a speciation rate ridiculously faster than anything that we can see in any of the speciation literature.
Right, and we have
then
another...
they're saying macroevolution can't happen because speciation can't produce great change, but it can produce change enough in all of the species of finch in just a short amount of time.
But we had 180,000.
Yeah.
Um,
And so you've got the two bottlenecks in there on the ark. In addition to, they've got a couple therapsids shown in there. Oh, and there's another thing of the parasitism involved. All of the critters that they show in there, the extinct critters, they're stealing the science of the actual evolutionary paleontologist. Everything they put up about what those animals look like has come from the regular science literature. They're shameless parasites. There's not a single functional paleontologist in that field that's contributed any information on that systematics. I don't have to guess at it. I know it. And so they're shameless parasites. They have bottlenecks in their own argument. They can't account for all the species, and they certainly can't account for the reptile-mammal transition. The last line in my slam dunk book was, if God doesn't want me to believe in evolution, he shouldn't have created therapsids. That was just plain dumb.
Speaking of that, we do have another question in the chat. If evolution is theory of the fittest, why did man lose so much physical strength, protection from natural light, and a smaller brain size than Neanderthals, and many other areas that aren't the fittest? I think that would be a fun one.
First of all, define fit. We're not runts. In fact, the Homo erectus that spread all over the place were fairly tall. They were just about the same height of human beings. Neanderthals are somewhat more robust. They're off on a siding, so they're anatomically distinct from us. Yes, they have a larger physical brain size than we do, but without being able to see too much about the convolutions and superstructure and stuff that's going on there, there's a lot of variation going on in there. They were certainly not an unsuccessful species. I mean, they were around for 500,000 years. That's no small potatoes. They went through ice ages and a whole bunch of other things. They finally got stressed out in the ends of things. It's still an ongoing and fascinating issue as to why the Neanderthals didn't make the cut finally. One argument is that their cultural system wasn't quite as resilient. They didn't trade in as wide a networks as humans did.
Wasn't one of the other issues that they didn't, I've heard that they didn't domesticate dogs, and that was one of the things that helped a lot.
That's a possibility. They may not have been good with that animal husbandry issue. And another point was they lived a dangerous lifestyle. Their hunting techniques, they never developed the atlatl, which humans eventually did, which is a spear thrower. So all of if you want to hunt a big critter, it's close hand. In fact, there was just a brand new paper out on the injuries that you find in Neanderthals. They have all the characteristics of like rodeo riders that are bull riders. They have a lot of close injuries and stuff where you're putting the thing in and you're thrown over and all that. And so the lifespan of a Neanderthal was just somewhat short. So it may have been the situation that enough effects of things combined meant that the pesky little humans that were just a little better at long-range connections, that may have had a slightly different language. That's another big puzzling issue that we don't know of from Neanderthals. Any paleoanthropologist would sell his grandmother to be able to get in a time machine and actually listen to the speech going on between Neanderthals, and or how much was going on in Homo erectus, how much it was going even all the way back to Australopithecines, and the origins of language that way. We know Neanderthals boinked occasionally with human beings, and they were therefore close enough that they could successfully interbreed, but it was very rare. I think the numbers are that it only would take about 100 or 200 interbreeding moments in the course of the entire interaction between humans and Neanderthals to produce the amount of genetic flow that we've seen in the current population. So, and we still don't know whether or not it was in one direction or another or both. In other words, was it a Neanderthal man going with a human female or vice versa? And sometimes you can have differential breeding where one will be successful in one direction but not in another. So it may very well have been that it was going on in both directions, but only one side was successful because of the peculiarities of zygotic isolation mechanisms. And now we're getting into the nitty-gritty of higher level genetics, and I think that's outside of all of our pay grades.
So just to clarify, earlier you said like the Neanderthals, they did have bigger brains, but the convolutions are to be taken into account. But bigger isn't always better with brain size, because as of right now, 1/3 of all our calories that go in our bodies are spent keeping our brain alive.
It was different. it would be fascinating to find out what different they were. But we don't have living Neanderthals. We can't see, we can't give them intelligence tests or cultural framework. There's assertion that some of the cultural transition traits, if they have relatively short lifespans, to what extent did they never have the grandparents to tell them things? So to what extent did they have a somewhat diminished ability to pass on traditions and insights from one generation to the next? We can't measure that because we can't get close enough to them to do that because we don't have the damn time machine. Get on that, Suris.
Actually, it's Aaron Ra who says that he has the time machine, but unfortunately his time machine is only a viewing one, and he uses it to debunk theists exclusively.
I tried to use my time machine, but I got to give Bonneville Power Administration a 300-year warning, and it's just a pisser.
Goes back 5 seconds, sucks his own dick.
What? What?
Oh, by the way,
how to derail a conversation?
Something about sucking his own dick. That's Steve Bannon. We don't want to go on to that.
This is the woman I've chosen to live my life with, everybody. I apologize.
I'll plug, while we're on the subject of time machines, since time travel figures in my Paralogs of Phileas Fogg novel, you can find links to that too. If you like Jules Verne and steampunk and all that kind of stuff, you can get that book as a double feature with Slam.
All right, so we do have one more thing. We've got 10 more minutes left on the stream, so if anybody has any last-minute questions, with the foreknowledge that they will not all be answered. Let me say not all be answered, because saying questions won't answer them. So he said modern humans diverged from Neanderthals some 600,000 years ago, and a new study shows the Y chromosome might be what kept the two species separate. Do you have any thoughts on that?
It could very well be. I'm not exactly familiar with the technical paper. The date sounds about right. All the stuff that I've seen, it's about 600,000 years ago. And we're not sure of all the fiddly bit details. I can't remember whether it's Homo ergaster or one of the Homo rodolphus, since I get all of the H's muddled up on these unless I look on the chart. Somebody like Jackson Wheat can keep all of these things straight in my head. I have to write down notes. But we're not at all sure the branching points as to how humans split off from that Homo erectus blob. In many ways, this settled a debate that had been big fistfights in earlier years by showing that both sides were right and both sides were wrong. The normal approach was there was a completely out of apples. The other was multi-regional, where there was a Homo erectus population that spread out, and there were these multi-regional blobs that became known as Homo neanderthal and all that. And they would actually be all basically one gigantic mush. Well, both are right and both are wrong. It looks now that we can see, especially with those mysterious descendants, and the little tiny chunks of those DNA apparently show up in human beings. And we're not entirely sure on the map there in that region that's northeast of where the Neanderthals were. The Neanderthals were mainly in Europe, and they bumped into humans down in the modern middle area where there was crossover. And human beings apparently never got into Europe until after the Neanderthals checked out. I don't think any paleoanthropologist thinks that we have all the data blips. We've just found these new examples that push Homo sapiens in northern Africa back maybe 300,000 years, which suggests
Morocco,
more
right?
interest there. Yeah. And then plus going back even farther into the primates side of it, the finding of these Cretan early primates and that suggests there's more going on there. Yipes. It's always fun and games, but it still won't change the big picture that you can see the Australopithecines, and eventually you've got this Homo erectus that spreads out all over the place, and then eventually Homo sapiens comes in and replaces them, and there spreads, and we've got the benchmarks and all of that. None of that data is going to change noticeably. You still have the people in America about 15 or 20,000 years ago. We don't have evidence that human beings or Homo erectus was here 1 million years ago. And so that stuff is not likely to be changing, but don't get your knickers in a snit if there are fiddly bit adjustments because some new data comes along.
That is one of my favorite things that I've heard theists get in a spit about whenever they say that, oh, well, science is bad because it can change so much. And I just kind of have to drop my jaw and go, you do realize that your holy book, if we were to just take the Quran, for example, your holy book, the reason it's bad is because it can't change Surah 2.
Oh, and worse, ironic, that also isn't true. because the Old Testament view of God starts out as kind of only one God among many, and it's just the most powerful. Why your God can turn a snake into a stick, but my God can beat your God. And only later on, over time, does it evolve into the God is the only God that exists at all. And now we have to figure out, what do we do with all those weird things? Oh, they become archangels, and then there's Leviathan, where they become mythologized and varied. And then you get this Ahura Mazda Zoroastrian idea of good versus evil that starts percolating into the worldview that eventually ends up with the Essenes and the groups that eventually lead off into the Judaism that now has to react to that. And now you have the idea of Satan as an anti-god and all that. So even their religion evolves over time. They just don't notice all of that too closely and don't allow it to be undergoing a actual variation along with everything else. Nothing is ever fixed.
Gotcha. Jim, the personal question that you said you had, is that the one that you asked earlier, or is that one still
no, that was Polystrate trees when we talked off camera.
Okay, then the last time? We have time for one more, and I do have it in here because it's one that I'm actually interested in.
All right.
Okay.
And this is the last question we have time for, and then we're going to do final thoughts. What are your thoughts on intervention theory, hybridization of early hominids?
Ooh, wow. Can you clarify that one? Intervention theory.
We can ask. He is watching the stream, so he could probably answer the intervention.
Yeah, because I'm not sure what are we planning on interbreeding early hominids. I would suspect that every hominid that was even slightly randy might be potentially interbreeding with their close cousins. So this happens in the natural environment anyway. But unless he has a specific instance of what that bears on things, I'm not entirely sure what that pops up in. It don't ring no bells on a hot topic issue in the regular science literature, as far as I can see.
But like with the elongated skulls issue from before, was one that just needed a little bit of clarification for the Google to start working.
Yeah, like what the hell are you talking about, kid?
And then with a little clarification, it's like, oh, I do actually understand that one. So we will give that a little bit of time there. Hopefully that can be the last question, but because I would like that one to be the last question that is here. With that said, Jim, I would like to know what your thoughts have been so far.
But this has just been beyond my wildest expectations. I'm a novice at it, and I've just, it's just fascinating subject, and this has just been a wealth of knowledge. And
you didn't expect this coming on because you didn't know. No. You didn't. I didn't expect this when I hopped on the Godless Iowans channel.
I know how you feel now.
Yes, it's the same thing.
So yeah, this has been a treat. So I'll save it for the closing statements.
The clarification is there. He said that at some point in time there was some outside source that modified Homo sapiens.
Oh gosh, that's one that seems to have escaped any of the technical literature that I've seen. Can we be more specific about this outside source? Was it Marduk? Was it Doctor Who? Who exactly was this? That given the range in natural variation in populations, this might connect up with something else, because Stuckley and Thayner's paper,
Dr. Ellis Silver proposition, is what he said.
Oh, that one. Okay, let me write a little note on down there, because I don't have any of my spreadsheets and stuff open, so I can't look that. Ellis Silver, you say?
Dr. Ellis Silver proposition.
Silver proposition, as opposed to the gold or zinc proposition. Okay.
As I'll check out that as opposed to.
I'll look to see who all I've got on that, and we can always I can always put a commentary later. There's going to be like a commentary on the YouTube.
There's going to be comments on. There's going to be comment. I enable comments on all my videos. I don't delete comments even if they're telling me to go die.
Yeah, I don't see a point. If you're going to shoot your mouth off, it's going to be here forever, kids.
Yes, exactly.
Anyway, shoot me a link to that, and I'll look into that, and I can put a further comment about what relates to that, because my curiosity consumes me.
Okay. Then I will, again, like with everything else, I will try to compile what I can to send to you, and then anything else that is clarification on what has been said in the stream, especially this one, since I was hoping this could be the last question, those will be in the comment section so that clarification can be there. Since we have done 2 times of Stump the RJ.
It's possible to do. I don't know everything.
Well, I've still got so many more questions, but I'm going to have you on my show now.
I kind of figured that was going to be what ended up coming from this.
Pick my brain. Pick my brain.
With that said, now that we are at the last 2.5-ish minutes of the stream, Jim Hall, you said that there was something that you wanted to say and you were saving it for the end of the stream. So go at it.
No, just plugs. Well, also there's fireworks going on hardcore outside right now. This is the one time of the year as an Iraq war veteran that it's great to have headphones on because it does kind of affect my PTSD. So I've got to thank you for keeping me away from that environment. and lastly, we are Atheist Edge on YouTube, Twitter, Patreon, PayPal, Facebook, Instagram, Stitcher, FM Player, and Apple iTunes. Thank you.
All righty. With that said, RJ, what would you like to say as your closing remarks for everything that's gone on so far?
Well, I hope your friend's questions about who was an atheist who was doubtful about evolution, I hope the answerings helped a bit. Let him off on some potential investigative things where he can figure out more about what's going on. In a philosophical sense, everybody has to deal with the fact that we have a huge swath of information that's accumulated over the last couple hundred years about the things that have been alive on the planet, not just us. Don't home in on just our little teeny. Every little nematode worm and every little ant has its own evolutionary lineage that goes back just as far as ours does. And they're just as fascinating to deal with. And so my take-home point is that we've got a golden age of science availability in a way that nobody has an excuse for ignorance in 2018. Even 15 years ago, when so much information wasn't available online, and twaddle is available online too, and you got to be able to have a sound method to tell the difference between the two. But everybody can check these things out on their own, and if you're going to make an argument that, oh, well, the authorities are all wrong, well, you jolly well better investigate it enough to be more certain of that, and not just dive off the gangplank of somebody's secondary sources. So
RJ,
hopefully
people want to know your YouTube channel in the chat. So give up your YouTube channel.
Well, if they go to my main website, that you can find a link right there. I put that in the Tortugan website. I got links to the books. I've got all that download stuff that you can get to.
What is your website again?
That is tortugan.wordpress.com. I never even discussed Tortugan.
Tortugan.
Yep.
All right.
Tortucan.
There we go.
That's the neologism I came up with. It's for Latin for turtle. It was to describe people who have a mind shell. Then this is what you'd encountering, that you can throw data at people all over the place, but it just bounces right off. Why? Because they're hunkered down in their little worldview down in there. And I didn't want to call them turtle people because that's insulting to turtles. So
are you saying are you saying calling a turtle something analogous to Ken Ham is insulting to the turtle? That's beautiful.
Exactly. So Tortugan instead. And it also is not a pejorative. It's just a descriptive. To say somebody has a Tortugan mind is not to say that they're stupid or bright. It's not to say that they're left-wing or that they're religious or atheist. It's not to say that they're an evolutionist. Or it will tell you that they have a knack for not thinking about things they don't want to think about, that they have this tunnel vision, a way of approaching data field. Now, you'll find it relentlessly in everybody that believes things that isn't true. You'll find that those 4 principles I laid out in the beginning are all popping up in spades. And so the shorthand form is I can go Tortugan alert. And that's covering it. Now, you may discover some of them are extremely bright people. Duane Gish was a very bright person. Philip Johnson, Richard Milton, an awful lot of the creationists you encounter at the upper echelon are not stupid, but they are Tortugans. And then a lot of the ones that you'll encounter on the social media, on Twitter and all the rest, are dull as a sack of hammers in many cases. They are also Tortugans.
Such as Eve Kaninen. But that said, for anybody who doesn't know Eve, congratulations. You are actually in a wonderful place in the world. With that said, I guess my final points would be there was nothing in today's stream that was meant to be pointed in any way, shape, or form to anyone who does have any questions about evolutionary theory and everything like that. I am obviously not an expert. And I wouldn't say that anybody here is a bona fide expert either, because there's just so much in the field. But there are resources out there, TIP being one of them, at least from the anti-creationist standpoint, that would be a wonderful place to go, especially if you're having any issue with, I would say Jehovah's Witnesses would be a very wonderful people to throw this at, considering that they think that humans came about 6,000 years ago, but the world is 3.9 billion years old. There are some interesting people who you can use this and other things as a resource for. But with all of that said, I would say that as per usual, guys, thank you all for coming out tonight. I truly enjoyed having this conversation with the both of you. I thank Jim for being able to hop on this stream and co-host with me on very short notice. This was
Let's do it again, baby. This is awesome.
Yeah,
this was put together like a day and a half ago.
Fun.
And I definitely thank RJ as well. All of his links, including his Patreon, his Tortugan website, and everything else, are going to be in the description. Well, they all already are in the description below. I've also retroactively put your YouTube channel in the description as well, so people can link it there. If I were to suggest anything for people who are hopping off of this, he has some wonderful discussions with Jackson Wheat. If any of you are familiar with him, I would definitely suggest go watch those discussions. And with everything said, my last sign off would be, as per usual, guys, I insert the end of video tagline here.